Gaza Strip, a sleepy history you need to hear. Forget everything the news has told you about Gaza. The modern tragedy you see on screen is merely the latest chapter in a 3,000-year-old war for a tiny strip of sand. This is not a new conflict, it is an ancient obsession. It's a prize coveted by empires, a graveyard of armies, and the pivot point upon which history has turned, again and again. Imagine trying to cram half the population of New York City onto a piece of land smaller than one of its boroughs. That's the Gaza Strip. A sliver of coast, 25 miles long and just a few miles wide, yet home to over 2 million people, making it one of the most crowded places on Earth. But the real question isn't how they fit. It's why this tiny, overcrowded patch of sand has been the obsessive focus of pharaohs, emperors, and prophets for millennia. The answer lies buried beneath the rubble, in a story that begins long before the modern world drew its angry lines on the map. Long before the pyramids of Giza were even a blueprint, people were building cities here. The first to claim this strategic coastline were the Canaanites, settling the fertile ground around the 3rd millennium BCE. These were not wandering nomads living in temporary camps. They were sophisticated urbanites. They erected massive fortified walls to protect their settlements, constructed sturdy homes from clay and stone, and built temple complexes to honor their gods. Their cities thrived because Gaza was not an isolated outpost, it was the world's most critical intersection. It was the land bridge connecting the colossal power of Egypt with the sprawling empires of Mesopotamia. It was the gateway to the Mediterranean Sea. Caravans laden with Egyptian grain, vibrant textiles, and fine pottery flowed north, while lumber, metals, precious jewels, exotic spices, and deadly weapons traveled south. This constant river of commerce made Gaza fabulously wealthy, a jewel of the ancient world whose strategic value was undeniable. Then, around the 12th century BCE, the world broke. A mysterious and violent wave of sea raiders, known to history as the Sea Peoples, crashed upon the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. They swept down from the Aegean Sea and the coast of Anatolia, a tide of warriors who toppled kingdoms and burned civilizations to the ground. Egypt, the reigning superpower, managed to repel the invasion but was left battered and weakened, its grip on the coastal territories slipping. Into this power vacuum stepped one of the most formidable groups of the Sea Peoples, the Philistines. They seized the southern coast of Canaan and established a powerful confederation of 5 city-states known as the Pentapolis, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, Ekron, and at its very heart, the mighty fortress city of Gaza. Gaza became their capital, their stronghold, their sacred center. The Philistines were unlike anyone the region had ever seen. They brought with them a revolution forged in fire. They were masters of a new, terrifying technology, iron. While their neighbors still fought with brittle bronze swords that chipped and bent in battle, the Philistines wielded weapons of superior strength and sharpness. Archaeologists digging through the ruins of their cities unearthed caches of expertly crafted iron swords, spearheads, and armor, testaments to a military advantage that was absolute. This technological leap allowed them to dominate the region, creating an empire on the coast that stood defiant against all challengers. Their culture was as distinct as their weaponry. Their pottery was not the simple clay of the Canaanites but was elegantly decorated with geometric patterns, swirling birds, and fish, artistic styles that spoke of their origins in the distant Aegean. They did not worship the gods of the Levant. Their chief deity was Dagon, a fearsome god depicted as half-man, half-fish, and it was in Gaza that they built his largest and most magnificent temple complex, a site that drew priests and pilgrims from across their domain. They also worshipped Astarte, a powerful goddess of fertility and motherhood, celebrating her with music and dance. Excavations have even uncovered the remains of ancient Philistine breweries, revealing a people who perfected the art of making beer, a craft they enjoyed alongside their vibrant cultural life. For centuries, they were the undisputed masters of the coast, their power immortalized in the biblical tales of their legendary clashes with the emerging tribes of the Israelites. The iconic story of the young David felling the giant Philistine warrior Goliath is more than a simple fable. It is a cultural memory of the long and bitter struggle between the technologically advanced, urban Philistines of the coast and the scrappy, tribal highlanders of Judah. It was a conflict between two worlds, a fight for the very soul of the land that would define the next 1,000 years. Yet, the Philistine Golden Age could not last forever. Their distinct culture began to blur at the edges, mixing with the traditions of their neighbors. Then, the great empires of the East began to stir. In the 7th century BCE, the relentless war machine of the Assyrians swept across the Levant, followed by the mighty Babylonians. The Philistine city-states, once so powerful, were crushed under the weight of these conquests. Their independence was shattered. Over time, they dissolved completely into the sea of surrounding peoples, vanishing as a distinct ethnic group. But the name they gave the land, Palestine, would echo through all of history. Long before the Philistines faded, and even before their rise, Gaza was already a coveted prize. The pharaohs of Egypt saw the city not just as a trading post, but as the essential gateway to their northern ambitions. To understand Gaza's importance to Egypt, one must look to the campaigns of Pharaoh Thutmose III, a brilliant military strategist who ruled in the 15th century BCE. During his relentless conquests in the Levant, he marched his armies directly through Gaza. He left behind a permanent Egyptian garrison, transforming the city into an administrative hub of his expanding empire. The Egyptians knew its strategic value. For them, Gaza was the key forward base, the launchpad for every military operation in the region. This reality is carved into the stone walls of the Great Temple at Karnak, where detailed inscriptions celebrate Thutmose III's victories, listing Gaza among the cities that fell under his absolute control. 2 centuries later, under Pharaoh Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, Gaza's significance only grew. Known as Ramesses the Great, a prolific builder and warrior, he also mentioned Gaza repeatedly in his own monumental inscriptions. The city served as a vital supply depot and fortress for his campaigns against the Hittites. Archaeologists digging in the sands of Gaza unearthed a stone stele bearing the unmistakable cartouche of Ramesses II himself. This single artifact provided definitive proof of the intensity of the Egyptian presence and a precise timeline of their influence. The pharaohs brought more than soldiers and administrators, they brought their gods. Excavations have revealed fragments of statues depicting Egyptian deities like Horus, the falcon-headed god, and the divine family of Isis and Osiris. These finds confirm the existence of small temples and shrines built by Egyptian colonists and adopted by locals who embraced the powerful beliefs of the Nile Valley. As Egyptian power gradually waned around the 9th century BCE, a new, terrifying force emerged from Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire. Renowned for their military prowess and calculated cruelty, the Assyrians began a period of aggressive expansion. In the mid-8th century BCE, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III marched west and annexed Gaza into his vast empire. His campaigns are described in chilling detail within the famous Assyrian annals, clay tablets discovered in the ruined palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud. These records tell of Gaza's initial attempts to resist. The city's defiance was met with overwhelming force, its rebellion brutally crushed by the disciplined Assyrian army. Another stunning piece of evidence comes from the Palace of Sargon II, where massive stone reliefs and inscriptions list Gaza among his conquered cities. The texts reveal that the Assyrians established a large military garrison there, converting the city into a formidable outpost to control the southwestern frontier of their empire. Gaza became a recurring flashpoint for anti-Assyrian resistance. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib led a punitive campaign against the Philistine coast, laying waste to numerous cities. He partially destroyed Gaza's fortifications, a punishment for its role as a hotbed of rebellion against Assyrian domination. When the Assyrian Empire finally crumbled, Babylon rose to take its place as the next great power in the Near East. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, famous for his conquest of Jerusalem and the subsequent exile of its people, turned his attention to the Mediterranean coast in the 6th century BCE. Gaza was one of the key cities captured during this campaign. The official Babylonian chronicles name Gaza as a vital administrative center in their coastal territories, a hub from which they controlled critical trade and military routes. Archaeological digs confirm this, uncovering distinctive Babylonian cylinder seals made of stone. These small, intricately carved objects, bearing cuneiform script, were used by officials to stamp and authorize documents. They often depicted symbols of Babylonian gods like Marduk and Ishtar, demonstrating the cultural footprint of the new rulers. Even more revealing are the clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform that have been found in Gaza. These unique documents offer a window into the daily life of the city under Babylonian rule. They record economic transactions, tax payments, judicial rulings, and even personal disputes over debts and inheritances. Such records allow us to reconstruct not just grand political events, but the mundane reality of how local institutions functioned under the watch of Babylonian officials. The discovery of a rare Babylonian coin, stamped with the image of a lion, a classic symbol of Babylon, further underscores Gaza's special economic and political status. Finding such a coin far from Babylonia proper is exceptional. Archaeologists have also located Babylonian burial sites from the 6th century BCE, proving that Babylonians settled in the city in significant numbers. Inside these tombs, they found jewelry, weapons, and household items, painting a picture of Gaza as a true melting pot of cultures. The next pivotal chapter in Gaza's story arrived with one of the most famous conquerors in human history, Alexander the Great. After shattering the Persian Empire, Alexander marched his Macedonian army south toward Egypt in 332 BCE. To secure his path and consolidate his power over the region, he had to take Gaza. It was no simple task. The city was a heavily fortified stronghold, built on a high mound that made any assault incredibly difficult. It stood as one of the most formidable fortresses on the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, commanded by a Persian eunuch named Battus. He was a veteran soldier, brave and resolute, fully aware of the power of Alexander's army but determined to resist to the last man. As the Macedonians approached, Alexander could see the city's immense walls looming over the landscape. He knew this would be no easy victory. What happened next changed everything. Alexander offered terms. He stood before the towering walls, a conqueror accustomed to cities opening their gates. He proposed a peaceful surrender, a pragmatic solution. But Battus, the city's commander, refused. He trusted his formidable walls, the high mound Gaza was built upon, and the fighting spirit of his men. His defiance was absolute. This refusal sealed the city's fate. The siege began. It was a masterpiece of Macedonian military engineering and sheer brutality. Alexander's army constructed enormous siege engines, looming wooden towers that crawled toward the walls, great battering rams that slammed against the stone, and powerful catapults that hurled massive rocks and flaming projectiles into the city. Assault after assault followed. The Macedonians would charge, screaming their war cries, only to be met by a hail of arrows and stones. The defenders fought with desperate courage, repelling every attempt to breach their fortress. The campaign dragged on under a punishing sun. Heat and a dire shortage of fresh water tormented the besiegers as much as the defenders. Days bled into weeks. During one furious assault, as Alexander led from the front, an arrow pierced his shoulder. The wound was deep, nearly fatal. His men watched in horror as their king was carried from the battlefield, but his spirit was unbreakable. Even while gravely injured, he refused to relinquish command. His presence and iron will a constant inspiration to his exhausted army. His personal resolve electrified his soldiers, turning their fatigue into a burning desire for vengeance. After 2 grueling months, the breakthrough finally came. The relentless pounding of the rams created a breach in the walls, and the Macedonians poured into the city like a flood. The consequences were horrific. Enraged by the stubborn resistance and the pain of his wound, Alexander unleashed his army's full fury. He ordered the city's fortifications to be torn down, stone by stone. The defenders who had fought so bravely were slaughtered. Battus, the commander, was captured alive and dragged before the conqueror. Alexander, impressed by his courage but infuriated by his defiance, ordered a uniquely cruel execution. Emulating the mythic rage of Achilles against Hector, he had Battus's feet pierced and bound to a chariot. The brave defender of Gaza was then dragged around the walls of his own fallen city until he was dead. The message was clear and terrifying: this was the price of defying Alexander the Great. Yet, destruction was only half of Alexander's strategy. He immediately began to rebuild Gaza, not as a Persian outpost, but as a Greek city, a polis. He settled it with people loyal to him, transforming it into a vital military and commercial hub for his new empire. The old, winding streets were replaced with a grid of straight avenues. A central market square, the agora, was built, along with temples dedicated to the Greek gods. This was the beginning of a profound cultural shift, the start of Hellenistic influence that would reshape the entire region for centuries. With Gaza secured, the path to Egypt was now open. Alexander marched his army into the land of the pharaohs, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule. Centuries passed. Alexander's empire rose and shattered, but Gaza endured. A new power, more organized and relentless than any before, had spread its eagle-wing standards across the known world, Rome. In the 1st century BCE, as Rome consolidated its control over the Mediterranean, Gaza was reborn with a new and vital purpose. The city transformed into one of the most important commercial centers in the entire Roman Empire. Rome's interest was intensely practical. Gaza was the final stop, the critical terminus of the legendary incense route. This was the path by which the most precious commodities of the ancient world traveled from the distant lands of Arabia and India into the heart of the empire. Caravans laden with frankincense, myrrh, and rare spices arrived at Gaza's gates, their valuable cargo destined for the temples and villas of Rome. In an age where these fragrant resins were worth more than their weight in gold, controlling their flow meant controlling immense wealth. Gaza, sitting at this crucial intersection of land and sea routes, grew fantastically rich. The Romans invested heavily in the city's infrastructure, paving its streets with stone and constructing grand public buildings. A new port, Neapolis, was established nearby to handle the immense volume of maritime trade. The city flourished, becoming a cosmopolitan hub where Greek philosophy, Roman law, and local Semitic traditions mingled under a veneer of imperial order. Its schools of rhetoric became famous throughout the eastern Mediterranean, drawing students from far and wide. For centuries, Gaza was a jewel of the Roman East, a testament to the power of commerce and the strategic genius of its imperial masters. Its prosperity was built on pagan foundations. The city's patron deity was Mars, a god worshipped as the lord of rains and grain, whose magnificent temple, the Marnion, dominated the city's skyline. This temple was the center of civic and religious life, a place of immense wealth and political power. But a new faith was stirring in the heart of the empire. It was a faith born in the nearby hills of Judea, one that spoke of a single, all-powerful God. Christianity arrived in Gaza not with an army, but carried on the lips of merchants and missionaries. At first, it was a whisper. A small, often persecuted community gathered in secret, their beliefs a direct challenge to the pantheon of gods that had secured Gaza's fortunes. The city's pagan elite, whose power was inextricably linked to the temple of Mars, viewed this new religion with deep suspicion and hostility. They saw it as a threat to their traditions, their economy, and their very way of life. For decades, the two worlds existed in a state of tense opposition. The Christians grew in number, their conviction unshakable, while the followers of Mars clung fiercely to their ancient rites. The turning point came at the close of the 4th century with the arrival of a man named Porphyry as the city's bishop. He was a man of iron will and unbending faith, determined to extinguish the last embers of paganism in his dominion. Gaza was one of the final, most stubborn holdouts in an empire that was rapidly becoming officially Christian. Porphyry saw the magnificent Marnion not as a work of art or a piece of heritage, but as a demonic fortress that had to be torn down. His initial efforts were met with violent resistance. The pagan majority controlled the city council and had the governor's ear. They harassed the Christian community, barred them from public office, and ensured the old gods remained supreme. Frustrated but not defeated, Porphyry embarked on a perilous journey to the imperial capital of Constantinople. He sought a direct appeal to a higher power, the Empress Eudoxia. He argued his case in the gilded halls of the imperial palace, describing Gaza as a cancerous blight of idolatry within a Christian empire. His passionate plea worked. The Empress, a devout Christian herself, was convinced. She issued an imperial decree ordering the destruction of all pagan temples in Gaza. Porphyry returned not just with a piece of parchment, but with an imperial official and a contingent of soldiers to enforce the order. The news sent shockwaves through the city. The followers of Mars were stunned, their political protection instantly evaporated. The destruction of the Marnion was a systematic and brutal affair. For days, soldiers and Christian zealots worked to dismantle the sacred site. They smashed the idols, toppled the marble columns, and set fire to the structure that had been the spiritual heart of Gaza for centuries. The pagan population watched in horror and helplessness as their world was literally torn down before their eyes. On the smoldering ruins of their most sacred place, Porphyry immediately began construction of a massive church, its foundations laid directly over the desecrated pagan sanctuary. The message was unmistakable. A new god had conquered Gaza. The city's identity was forcibly remade, its past erased and replaced. Under the Byzantine Empire, the Christian successor to Rome in the east, Gaza was transformed into a prominent center of faith and learning. Monasteries flourished in the surrounding desert, and the School of Gaza produced some of the era's most brilliant Christian scholars and theologians, their work shaping religious thought across the empire. The city had found a new purpose, a new identity built on the ashes of the old. What happened next changed everything. In the 7th century, a new storm gathered in the deserts of Arabia. It swept across the old empires with a speed and force that seemed to defy the limits of the possible. For Byzantine Gaza, a city that had spent centuries defining itself within the Christian world, the arrival of Arab armies under the banner of Islam was a cataclysm. The city fell, and the world changed overnight. The new rulers established a different kind of order. They did not seek to annihilate the existing communities. Christians and Jews living in the city were granted the status of dhimmi, protected peoples. In exchange for a special tax, the jizya, they were permitted to practice their faith, a policy of pragmatic tolerance that allowed their ancient communities to endure for many more centuries. Yet the city's fundamental character began to shift, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum. Gaza started to acquire an unmistakably Islamic identity. Mosques began to rise, their minarets piercing the skyline. Madrasas, or religious schools, opened their doors, and the rhythm of public life began to align with an Islamic cultural and legal framework. One of the very first mosques built was the Great Mosque of Omar, erected pointedly on the site of a ruined Byzantine church, echoing the Christian conquest of the pagan Marnian centuries before. The construction of these new institutions championed the spread of the Arabic language and its rich culture, gradually displacing the Greek tongue and the Byzantine traditions that had dominated the city for so long. Absorbed into the vast new Arab Empire, first under the Damascus-based Umayyad Caliphate, Gaza rediscovered its ancient purpose. Its strategic position once again made it a vital commercial hub on the artery connecting Egypt, Arabia, and Syria. The city thrived, becoming a key node in the Caliphate's sophisticated economic system. Through its gates flowed caravans laden with shimmering silks from the east, aromatic spices that perfumed the air, and crates of dates and grains destined for the markets of the empire, ensuring the prosperity of its merchants and residents. Following the Umayyads, power shifted to the Abbasids, who ushered in a golden age of Arab culture and science that rippled out to every corner of their empire, including Gaza. The city blossomed into a respected center of Islamic scholarship and education. Its schools flourished, with teachers instructing students in medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and theology. Renowned Arab scientists, writers, and poets came to live and work within its walls. The Abbasids funded the construction of libraries and new madrasas that attracted scholars and students from across the Muslim world, transforming Gaza from a mere trading post into a vibrant cultural center with a sophisticated intellectual life. Archaeological excavations have since unearthed evidence of these numerous institutions and mosques, revealing rich architectural details and beautiful calligraphic inscriptions that speak to the city's enlightened status. This new era also transformed the land itself. The Arabs brought with them advanced irrigation techniques learned from Persia and Mesopotamia, allowing the fertile lands around Gaza to produce bountiful harvests. The city became famous for its cultivation of dates, olives, and grapes. Its exports of high-quality olive oil, wine, and dried fruits were prized goods, shipped across the entire territory of the Caliphate. But the centralized power of the Abbasid caliphs began to weaken by the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Gaza fell under the control of a succession of local dynasties and warlords, from the Fatimids to the Seljuks. This fragmentation led to frequent conflicts and a new era of instability. Even through this turmoil, Gaza's economic importance never truly faded. It remained a major commercial and agricultural center. The arrival of Islam and the Arab conquests had radically and permanently altered the city's cultural, religious, and economic landscape, elevating it from a peripheral Byzantine town to a significant hub of Islamic civilization. Then, from across the sea, came a new kind of conqueror. At the end of the 11th century, the kingdoms of Europe launched a series of military expeditions to the Middle East known as the Crusades. Their primary goal was to seize control of Jerusalem and other Christian holy sites from Muslim rule, and their campaigns engulfed the entire region of Palestine. Gaza, sitting on the crucial land bridge between Egypt and the Holy Land, found itself directly in the path of the storm. The Crusaders first attempted to capture the city in the early 12th century, shortly after their conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. But Gaza was a well-fortified stronghold under the control of the powerful Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. For the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem, controlling the city meant severing the primary route for Egyptian armies marching north into Palestine. The Crusaders launched several assaults, but the city's Muslim defenders were prepared, repelling the European armies for decades. It wasn't until 1152, under King Baldwin III, that the Crusaders finally broke through and captured Gaza, incorporating it into their kingdom. Their hold, however, proved to be fragile and short-lived. In 1187, the legendary Muslim commander, Saladin, inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Crusader armies at the Battle of Hattin. He swept through Palestine, retaking nearly all of its territory, including Gaza. For Saladin and his Ayyubid dynasty, Gaza was of immense strategic value, serving as a shield for Palestine against invasions from Egypt and as a vital supply point. After recapturing the city, he heavily reinforced its defenses, building new fortress walls, towers, and fortifications. Under his rule, the city experienced another renaissance, once again becoming a vital cultural and commercial link between Egypt and Damascus. But the struggle for Gaza was far from over. The Third Crusade brought new armies from Europe, led by famous monarchs like the English king, Richard the Lionheart, all determined to reclaim the Holy Land. The Crusaders once again set their sights on the strategic prize of Gaza. The greatest armies of the Christian and Muslim worlds were now set on a collision course, and the fate of the city hung precariously in the balance. But that was only the beginning. Despite the fury of the Third Crusade, Gaza did not fall. The great armies of Richard the Lionheart and other European monarchs crashed against the walls of the Holy Land, winning skirmishes and battles, but they could never secure a permanent hold on the city. Gaza remained under Muslim control, a stubborn bastion on the road to Egypt. Yet the long war left an indelible mark. The decades of sieges, assaults, and shifting powers had bled into the very stone and soul of the city. This was not a simple story of conqueror and conquered. It was a violent, chaotic, and unexpectedly fertile exchange. The fighting brought immense destruction, but in its wake, new ideas and technologies flowed in both directions. European siege craft met Islamic defensive architecture. Frankish blacksmithing techniques for forging stronger swords and armor were adopted and refined in local workshops. Archaeological digs reveal the curious fusion of this era, the foundations of fortified towers and massive stone walls built in the European style, often standing near the elegant arches of a new mosque or the quiet courtyard of a madrasa where Arabic literature and science flourished. During brief periods of Crusader influence, churches were built and Christian quarters sprang up, housing European merchants and pilgrims whose presence introduced new goods and customs. The city became a crucible, a place where the traditions of Christianity and Islam, East and West, were hammered together in the forge of war. Its population swelled with a complex mix of Arabs, Egyptians, Syrians, and Europeans, creating a multilingual, multicultural hub where survival depended on adaptation. This era of bloody exchange ended when a new power rose from the south. They were the Mamluks, a dynasty forged from an institution of warrior slaves. Recruited as boys from the steppes of Central Asia and the Caucasus, they were Turkic, Circassian, and Mongol children trained from youth in the arts of war and the traditions of Islam, molded into an elite military caste fiercely loyal to their masters. In the mid-13th century, these warrior slaves seized power for themselves, taking control of Egypt and Palestine. For the Mamluks, Gaza's strategic value was not just important, it was existential. It was the northern gate to Egypt, the essential buffer against the two threats they feared most, the lingering Crusaders on the coast and the terrifying Mongol hordes sweeping in from the east. Under Mamluk sultans, Gaza was reborn as a fortress. They poured immense resources into its defenses, rebuilding and expanding the walls Saladin had erected. New towers rose, moats were deepened, and the city was transformed into a formidable military base. The legendary Sultan Baybars, a brilliant commander who had crushed both a Crusader army and a Mongol invasion force, understood Gaza's role perfectly. He personally oversaw the strengthening of its fortifications, turning it into the linchpin of his empire's northern frontier. But the Mamluks were more than just soldiers, they were shrewd administrators. With security established, trade exploded. Gaza sat astride the vital caravan route between Cairo and Damascus, and the Mamluks ensured it thrived. Caravanserais, sprawling inns for travelers and their animals, were built to accommodate the endless flow of merchants. The city's markets overflowed with cotton, textiles, spices, and agricultural goods. It became a celebrated center for Islamic scholarship, with new schools and libraries attracting thinkers from across the Muslim world. For 2.5 centuries, Gaza prospered under Mamluk rule. Then, in 1516, at the Battle of Marj Dabak in northern Syria, the Mamluk cavalry, once the most feared in the world, was shattered by the cannons and muskets of a new, disciplined power, the Ottoman Empire. The victorious Ottoman Sultan, Selim I, swept south, and Gaza fell soon after. The city was absorbed into a vast empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf. The Ottomans, like every power before them, immediately recognized Gaza's strategic importance. It remained a key stop on the road between Egypt and Damascus, a vital administrative center, and a major hub on the pilgrimage route to Mecca and Medina. Ottoman governors continued to invest in the city, building new mosques, public baths known as hammams, and bustling markets. Its population grew, drawing in settlers from across the Ottoman domains. Mediterranean sea trade brought new wealth, filling the port with ships and the warehouses with goods destined for the imperial heartland. This long period of Ottoman stability was violently interrupted at the very end of the 18th century. In 1799, a French army under an ambitious young general named Napoleon Bonaparte marched out of Egypt and into Palestine. He seized Gaza, using it as a forward base for his assault on the city of Acre further up the coast. The French occupation was brief, a fleeting episode in the city's long history, but it was a shocking reminder that Gaza's position on the map made it a prize coveted not just by regional powers, but by the great empires of Europe. The world was changing, and the city, once again, found itself at the center of a global collision. As the 19th century progressed, however, the world began to move on. New steamship routes and inland railways shifted the primary arteries of trade away from the old caravan paths. Gaza's global strategic importance slowly faded. The thunder of imperial armies was replaced by the quiet rhythms of agriculture. The city became a prosperous regional center, its fortunes tied to the export of olives, dates, grain, and cotton from the surrounding fertile lands. The Ottoman mosques, markets, and hammams remained, silent testaments to a grander past. For a resident walking the peaceful streets, it might have seemed that Gaza's long, violent history as an imperial crossroads was finally over. But this provincial quiet was an illusion, a calm before a storm of unimaginable scale. In the capitals of Europe, forces of industry, nationalism, and colonial ambition were redrawing the map of the entire world. For one young Ottoman official enjoying his peaceful posting in the ancient city, life was predictable, his future secure. Everything he knew was about to shatter. The old world died in the mud of the First World War. For the Ottoman official, and for everyone in Gaza, the collapse of his empire was not an abstract political event but a seismic shock. The familiar crescent flag was lowered, and a new one, the Union Jack, was raised in its place. The British Empire had arrived, and with it, the 20th century came crashing down on the city's ancient stones. British military planners saw immediately what the Ottomans had begun to forget: Gaza was the hinge between Africa and Asia. It controlled the coastal route, the irreplaceable land bridge connecting British-held Egypt to the territory they now called Mandatory Palestine. The city was swiftly transformed. A large military garrison was established, its uniformed soldiers becoming a common sight in the old markets. New administrative buildings rose, symbols of a foreign power. Roads were paved and railway lines were laid, not for the benefit of local merchants, but to move troops and supplies with imperial efficiency. Gaza was no longer a provincial backwater, it had become a critical military and administrative hub for the British in southern Palestine. This new order brought with it a new and deeply unsettling reality. A political movement born in the drawing rooms and conference halls of Europe began to reshape the very soil of the land. Zionism, the call for a national home for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, gained powerful British support. Jewish immigration from Europe, which had been a trickle, swelled into a steady stream. These newcomers, fleeing persecution and fired by ideological fervor, began purchasing large tracts of land and establishing exclusive agricultural settlements. While few of these settlements were established in the immediate vicinity of Gaza, the ripple effects were felt instantly. A deep anxiety gripped the local Arab population. They watched as familiar landscapes were altered and saw their access to land and economic resources shrink. A growing resentment began to simmer against the British authorities, who were seen not as neutral arbiters but as active facilitators of this demographic and political transformation. In the coffee houses and mosques of Gaza, whispers turned into organized movements. Arab nationalist and Islamic groups began to form, their primary goals clear: resist the British colonial regime and halt the tide of mass Jewish immigration that they feared would dispossess them entirely. The simmering tension finally boiled over. The years between 1936 and 1939 saw the Great Arab Revolt, a furious uprising that engulfed all of Palestine. Gaza became an epicenter of the resistance. The city's residents took to the streets in protest, their demonstrations frequently erupting into violent clashes with British troops and police. They blocked the new imperial roads, sabotaged railway lines, and launched attacks on British patrols and government facilities. The surrounding villages became bases for armed insurgents who waged a guerrilla war against both the British military and nearby Jewish settlements, turning the once peaceful agricultural hinterland into a battlefield. The British response was swift and brutal. Martial law was declared. The empire brought its full weight to bear on the rebellious city. Mass arrests and house-to-house searches became daily occurrences, shattering the sanctity of family life. A web of military checkpoints choked movement, isolating Gaza from the rest of the country. British military records from the time detail the harshness of the repression, the demolition of homes belonging to suspected rebels, the internment of activists and leaders, and the collective punishment of entire villages. This iron-fisted suppression crushed the revolt, but it also forged a lasting legacy of bitterness and defiance, hardening anti-British and anti-Zionist sentiment into an unbreakable core of the local identity. A brief, tense quiet fell during the Second World War, but the moment the global conflict ended, the local one reignited with even greater intensity. In 1947, the newly formed United Nations, dominated by the victorious Allied powers, unveiled its solution, a plan to partition Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. According to this plan, Gaza was to be part of the new Arab state. But the proposal was viewed by the Arab majority as a profound injustice, a colonial dictate that awarded a disproportionate share of their homeland to a minority of recent arrivals. They rejected it outright. The rejection set the stage for war. In 1948, as the last British soldiers departed, the State of Israel was declared, and the armies of neighboring Arab states, primarily Egypt, moved in. For the Palestinians, this war would become known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Gaza was thrown directly into the maelstrom. The city became a front line, rocked by fierce battles between the new Israeli army and Egyptian forces. But the most devastating impact was not the fighting itself, but the human tide it unleashed. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, fleeing or expelled from towns and villages captured by Israel, sought refuge in the one sliver of their homeland that remained outside Israeli control. They poured into Gaza, a desperate, dispossessed flood of humanity. In a matter of months, the population of the Strip nearly tripled. The city and its surroundings were overwhelmed. To house the newcomers, the first tent camps were erected: Jabalia, Shadi, Rafah. These sprawling cities of canvas and despair, intended as temporary shelters, soon became permanent features of the landscape. Families huddled together, facing severe shortages of water, food, and medicine, their old lives reduced to the few possessions they could carry on their backs. Gaza was no longer just a city, it had become a vast, overcrowded refugee camp, a symbol of Palestinian loss and a crucible of their national struggle. Under the new administration of Egypt, the city was severed from the rest of Palestine, its people trapped between a hostile new border and the sea. What happened next changed everything. After the 1948 war, Gaza fell under Egyptian control. Egyptian authorities faced immense challenges. They struggled to stabilize the region amidst economic hardship. Providing adequate aid proved difficult. Over time, the situation gradually improved. Egypt invested heavily in infrastructure, healthcare, and education. New schools, hospitals, and administrative buildings sprang up. Roads and urban utilities were modernized, improving daily life. A key feature of this era was the spread of Egyptian culture and education. Schools followed Egyptian curricula, with teachers and textbooks from Egypt. This strengthened cultural and social ties between Gaza and Egypt. Many Palestinians pursued higher education in Cairo and other Egyptian cities. However, Egypt tightly controlled Gaza's political life. Egyptian authorities feared instability and the radicalization of Palestinian refugees. They suppressed any independent political organizations. Palestinian nationalists advocating independence and resistance against Israel faced arrest and persecution. Egypt implemented strict security measures and increased police presence. This often caused tension with the local population. Yet, this period saw the emergence of the first Palestinian national movement organizations. These groups would later significantly influence the Palestinian cause. In the 1950s, the Fedayeen movement arose in Gaza. These Palestinian militants regularly raided Israeli territory. They aimed to sabotage and attack Israeli settlements and army patrols. These actions provoked harsh Israeli responses. Frequent clashes, shelling, and military operations ensued. The Gaza-Israel border became a constant conflict zone. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, suffering from instability and violence. Economically, Egyptian administration had its own complexities. Gaza remained heavily reliant on aid from the UN and international organizations. They supplied food, clothing, and medicine for the refugees. Simultaneously, Egypt tried to develop the local economy. Investments were made in agriculture and small-scale industry. However, limited resources and high population density led to chronic unemployment and poverty. Culturally, Egyptian control introduced new elements to Gaza. Egyptian literature, cinema, and music became widely popular. This had a lasting impact on Palestinian culture, bridging it closer to Egyptian culture. The Egyptian administration ended in 1967. During the Six-Day War, Israel captured Gaza. This concluded nearly 20 years of Egyptian control. It left behind mixed memories. Despite the hardships, this period laid many foundations for the future Palestinian national movement. It shaped the political and social structures that would define the region's history. By the mid-1960s, tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors reached a critical point. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan regularly exchanged threats. Armed clashes and mutual provocations occurred frequently on the borders. War felt imminent. The conflict was particularly acute between Israel and Egypt, then led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Egypt actively increased its military capabilities. It strengthened alliances with other Arab nations. Anti-Israeli rhetoric intensified. In May 1967, Egypt deployed significant forces to the Sinai Peninsula. This was right on the border with Israel. It closed the Straits of Tiran, strategically vital to Israel. This blocked access to Israel's port of Eilat on the Red Sea. These actions were accompanied by strong statements. They hinted at intentions to destroy Israel completely. Israeli authorities claimed an attack was necessary to secure the country. Egypt posed an imminent threat of aggression, they said. In this highly charged environment, Israel decided to launch a preemptive strike. It aimed to seize a strategic advantage. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a massive airstrike on Egyptian airfields. It destroyed a large part of the Egyptian Air Force in just a few hours. This gave Israel complete air superiority. It allowed a quick transition to a ground offensive. The next day, Israeli ground forces began advancing into the Sinai Peninsula. They rapidly pushed back Egyptian forces, capturing significant territory. Deprived of air support and shocked by the surprise attack, the Egyptian army was demoralized and retreated quickly. Soon, Israeli forces approached the Gaza Strip. It had been under Egyptian control since 1948. Egyptian units stationed in Gaza tried to resist. But serious defense proved impossible. The Egyptian army abandoned the sector almost without a fight. It quickly retreated deeper into the Sinai Peninsula. By June 8, 1967, the Gaza Strip was entirely under Israeli control. For the Palestinian population of Gaza, these events were a tragedy. The consequences are felt to this day. The initial Israeli occupation drastically worsened the situation. The sector was declared a closed military zone. Strict restrictions were imposed on the movement of residents and goods. The Israeli army deployed numerous checkpoints. It established strict control regimes. Any form of protest was actively suppressed. From the first days of the occupation, the number of Palestinian refugees soared. Thousands of Gazans were forced to leave their homes. Many ended up in overcrowded refugee camps. These camps were already struggling to cope with the influx of people after the events of 1948. Camps were unsanitary. There were severe shortages of food, water, and medicine. International organizations struggled to manage the humanitarian crisis. The Israeli administration immediately began a policy of establishing Jewish settlements. These were built on the occupied territories, including the Gaza Strip. Shortly after the war, the first settlements appeared. They were populated by Jews from Israel and abroad. This sparked anger and outrage among Palestinians. They saw the settlements as an attempt to displace them. It was an attempt to change the demographic composition of the region. The resentment of the Palestinian population quickly turned into active resistance. The world watched in silence. The resentment festering under occupation did not remain passive for long. It organized. In the alleyways and refugee camps of Gaza, the first armed cells of Palestinian militants began to form, many under the umbrella of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. These groups launched attacks on Israeli military patrols and installations, a guerrilla campaign of ambush and sabotage. Each attack provoked a swift and severe Israeli response. The cycle of violence tightened its grip, transforming the Gaza Strip into a zone of perpetual military conflict, where the rhythms of daily life were dictated by patrols, curfews, and the ever-present threat of confrontation. The economic consequences of the occupation were just as devastating. Israel seized absolute control over all economic and transportation arteries, effectively severing Gaza's trade with the outside world. Local businesses shuttered, their supply chains cut and markets lost. Unemployment skyrocketed. With few options left, thousands of Palestinian men were forced to seek work inside Israel itself. They became a pool of cheap labor, crossing checkpoints at dawn to build Israeli cities and work Israeli farms, often for low wages and with few rights, making them acutely vulnerable to exploitation. This daily humiliation fueled a deep-seated anger that simmered just beneath the surface. For 2 decades, this volatile status quo held. Resistance was a constant, low-grade fever of sporadic attacks and underground organizing. But in December 1987, the fever broke. The catalyst was a traffic collision in Gaza. An Israeli military truck slammed into a car, killing 4 Palestinian laborers. In the tense atmosphere of the occupation, this was no mere accident, it was the final spark in a tinderbox of accumulated rage. The incident triggered a mass uprising that became known as the First Intifada, an Arabic word meaning shaking off. Within days, the protests engulfed the entire Gaza Strip and spread to the West Bank. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians poured into the streets. This was not a war of armies, but a popular rebellion. The primary weapons were stones. Palestinian youth, their faces often masked by keffiyehs, became the iconic image of the resistance, confronting heavily armed Israeli soldiers with nothing more than slingshots and rocks. The uprising was characterized largely by civil disobedience. Palestinians organized mass strikes and demonstrations, refused to pay Israeli taxes, and boycotted Israeli goods. While the stone-throwing youth were its symbol, there were also more violent acts. Molotov cocktails were thrown, and sporadic attacks with knives and makeshift weapons targeted Israeli soldiers and settlers. The Israeli response was designed to crush the uprising with overwhelming force. Soldiers were ordered to break the bones of protesters. They used rubber bullets, massive quantities of tear gas, and, increasingly, live ammunition against the crowds. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed over the 6 years of the Intifada, and tens of thousands were wounded or arrested. Israel imposed round-the-clock curfews, shutting down entire towns for days on end. Schools and universities were closed, disrupting the education of an entire generation. Yet, the resistance could not be completely suppressed. The images of children fighting tanks with stones shocked the world. For the first time, the international community witnessed the sheer scale of desperation among Palestinians living under occupation. The Intifada thrust their plight onto the global stage, increasing diplomatic pressure on Israel to find a political solution. This pressure paved the way for a series of secret negotiations. In 1993, brokered by Norway, Israeli and PLO officials met in secret and produced a historic breakthrough, the Oslo Accords. The agreement was a landmark. For the first time, the PLO officially recognized the State of Israel, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The Accords laid out a framework for Palestinian self-governance, creating the Palestinian National Authority, PNA. This new body was to assume control over the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank. It was a moment of breathtaking hope. In 1994, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, who had spent decades in exile, made a triumphant return to Gaza. He arrived to establish the administrative structures of a nascent state. The PNA began to take over civilian functions, running schools and hospitals, managing police forces and public services. For the first time in a generation, Palestinians had a degree of control over their own lives. However, the optimism was fragile. The Oslo Accords left the most contentious issues, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees, and the final borders, unresolved. The fragile optimism of the Oslo Accords was about to be consumed by fire. By the year 2000, the hope that had defined the 1990s had curdled into deep disappointment. The most difficult issues remained unresolved, and a new, more violent chapter was about to begin. The Second Intifada erupted not as a planned campaign, but as a spontaneous explosion of long-simmering rage. The clashes that followed were brutal and devastating, claiming thousands of lives on both sides. But for the Gaza Strip, the impact was catastrophic. The territory was plunged into a state of near-total isolation. Israel sealed its borders, transforming the already crowded strip into a sealed cage. The movement of people and goods was choked to a trickle. Israeli military operations intensified, bulldozers razing homes and infrastructure deemed a security threat. Life for the average Gazan became an unbearable ordeal of checkpoints, closures, and constant fear. The economy, which had shown flickers of life under the new Palestinian Authority, completely collapsed. Unemployment soared to disastrous levels, and poverty became the norm for the vast majority of the population. The dream of a nascent state was being replaced by the nightmare of a besieged ghetto. This despair fundamentally altered the political landscape. The Palestinian Authority and its dominant party, Fatah, which had championed the peace process, saw their credibility disintegrate. They were increasingly viewed as ineffective, unable to either deliver a state through negotiations or protect their people from the harsh realities of the conflict. Into this vacuum of leadership and hope stepped more radical movements. Popularity surged for groups that rejected compromise and advocated for continued armed struggle. Chief among them was Hamas. Gaza became the epicenter of the most ferocious fighting. The Israeli army launched large-scale military campaigns, such as Operation Defensive Shield, aiming to dismantle militant networks and halt the constant rocket fire emanating from the Strip. The fighting was street to street, brutal and destructive. Entire city blocks and village neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, leaving thousands of Palestinians homeless. In response, Palestinian militants escalated their own attacks, firing crude rockets into Israeli towns and settlements. This created a powerful wave of fear and outrage within Israeli society, leading to immense public pressure on the government to take even tougher measures against Gaza. The international community watched with alarm, issuing periodic calls for an end to the violence, but its efforts at mediation proved fruitless. The cycle of attack and reprisal spun faster and faster. By the mid-2000s, the situation had become so intractable that the Israeli government made a stunning and unprecedented decision. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, once a champion of the settlement movement, announced a plan for a complete, unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip. In the late summer of 2005, the world watched as the Israeli army evacuated every single Jewish settler and dismantled every military base within the territory. For Palestinians, it was a moment of profound significance, widely seen as a victory, proof that their resistance had forced the occupiers to retreat. For Israel, the motivation was framed primarily in terms of security, a strategic calculation to reduce the constant friction and casualties involved in defending the isolated settlements. With the Israelis gone, full control of the Gaza Strip was handed over to the Palestinians. But the long-awaited peace did not arrive. Instead, the Israeli withdrawal created a power vacuum that unleashed a storm of internal conflict. The deep-seated rivalry between the two main Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, finally erupted into open warfare. These two groups represented two fundamentally different visions for the future. Fatah, the older, secular nationalist movement, had long been the face of the Palestinian cause, oriented toward a diplomatic solution and the creation of a state through negotiation and compromise. Hamas, born in the late 1980s from an Islamist ideology, fundamentally rejected any peace agreement with Israel. It defined its mission as armed struggle, with the ultimate goal of establishing an Islamic state over the entirety of historic Palestine. As the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority struggled to manage the daily crises of poverty and insecurity in post-disengagement Gaza, the popularity of Hamas continued to grow. They offered an alternative vision of pious resistance and social order. The simmering tension finally reached its boiling point. In June of 2007, the conflict exploded. Hamas militants executed a swift and decisive offensive across the Gaza Strip. They stormed key government buildings, police stations, and military installations controlled by Fatah. After several days of vicious street battles that shocked the Palestinian world, the Fatah forces were utterly defeated and driven from the territory. Hamas had seized total control. They established their own government, completely separate from and opposed to the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority that remained in the West Bank. This schism was the greatest crisis in modern Palestinian history. It formalized a deep ideological and political rupture, splitting the Palestinian territories in two. In the West Bank, Fatah continued to pursue a secular, moderate state-building project reliant on international diplomacy. But in Gaza, Hamas began to implement its own vision, a conservative, religious model of governance grounded in Islamic law. The two territories, now ruled by rival governments, were set on starkly different paths. The silence that fell over Gaza after the fighting was not one of peace, but of a profound and final break. The split created two starkly different realities. In the West Bank, Fatah continued its project of state-building, maintaining diplomatic ties with the world and Israel, receiving financial and political support. But Gaza, now under Hamas rule, was almost completely sealed off. Israel and Egypt imposed a strict economic and political blockade, a suffocating cordon designed to weaken Hamas and stop the flow of weapons. In reality, the restrictions delivered a crushing blow to ordinary Palestinians. They faced severe shortages of everything: medicine, food, clean water, fuel, electricity, and building materials. Life became a daily struggle for survival. Under the pressure of this intensifying isolation, tensions between Hamas and Israel grew explosive, regularly erupting into full-scale war. The cycle of violence began in December 2008. In response to constant rocket fire into southern Israel, the Israeli military launched Operation Cast Lead. For 3 weeks, Israeli jets, tanks, and infantry pounded the strip. The fighting left Gaza's infrastructure in ruins. When the dust settled, over 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis were dead. It was a pattern that would repeat with devastating regularity. The next major escalation came in November 2012. After another barrage of rockets from Gaza, Israel initiated Operation Pillar of Defense. This conflict was shorter, lasting only 8 days, but still incredibly violent. Around 180 Palestinians were killed, a significant number of them civilians, including women and children. The most destructive war yet erupted in the summer of 2014. The kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank unleashed a wave of violence and retaliatory fire. Israel launched Operation Protective Edge, a massive air and ground campaign that lasted for more than 7 weeks. The scale of the devastation was immense. Over 2,200 Palestinians, the majority civilians, were killed. More than 70 Israelis, mostly soldiers, also lost their lives. The conflict left hundreds of thousands in Gaza homeless, a tragic new chapter in the territory's recent history. Another round of intense fighting broke out in May 2021. Tensions in East Jerusalem over clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound exploded into a massive exchange of fire. Israel unleashed a furious aerial assault on Gaza. Hamas and other militant groups responded with a relentless volley of rockets aimed at Israeli cities. For 11 days, the violence raged. Around 260 Palestinians and 13 people in Israel were killed. Once again, thousands of Gazans were left without homes as the region's infrastructure suffered yet another devastating blow. Then came October 7, 2023. This day marked the beginning of the most catastrophic conflict in decades. Early that morning, Hamas militants launched a sudden, massive, and meticulously planned attack on Israel. They breached the heavily fortified border fence, swarming into Israeli towns and military bases. The Israeli authorities and army were caught completely by surprise. In the chaos that followed, Hamas fighters killed around 1,200 Israelis, overwhelmingly civilians, and dragged more than 240 hostages back into Gaza. The attacks were marked by a level of brutality that shocked the nation to its core. Israel's response was swift and absolute. It declared a state of war and launched Operation Swords of Iron, with the stated goal of completely destroying Hamas's military and governmental capabilities. Within days, Gaza was subjected to an air campaign of unprecedented intensity, followed by a full-scale ground invasion. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, turned into wastelands of rubble and twisted metal. The consequences for Gaza were catastrophic. The death toll among Palestinians soared past 15,000, then 20,000, then 30,000, the majority of them women and children. Hundreds of thousands were forced to flee their homes, seeking shelter in overcrowded camps or simply out in the open. The humanitarian situation devolved into a complete disaster. The conflict triggered a fierce international debate. Israel emphasized its right to self-defense and the necessity of eliminating the threat from Hamas. But many countries and international organizations condemned Israel for the immense number of civilian casualties and the disproportionate use of force. The UN and leading humanitarian groups called for an immediate ceasefire, but a lasting resolution remained elusive. The war revealed the deepest, most intractable contradictions of the conflict. The immense suffering and destruction further radicalized Palestinian society. In Israel, the trauma of October 7 unified the public behind its government's hardline stance. The prospects for peace, already dim, seemed to vanish completely. The cycle of violence had reached a horrifying new peak, leaving two peoples more entrenched, more traumatized, and more divided than ever before. In a conflict where both sides believe their very existence is at stake, how does a cycle of vengeance ever end?